Hey gang, it's your buddy Platt, and today I'm going to show you how to make a simple poutine mash. So let's go. Okay, first let's start with discussing what poutine is and how it's pronounced. It can either be pronounced poutine, like poutine, or poitine, or poutine was what a lot of people call it, not to be confused with the highly delicious Canadian dish of brown gravy, cheese curds, and fries. Don't confuse the two. What it is basically Irish moonshine. The Irish have a similar history of not liking the government regulations on the making of booze and the taxation of it, just like us here in America. The English in the mid-1660s put a tax on produced spirits, and that kind of led to pushback where many of the locals went to the hills and started producing outlaw spirit referred to as poutine. Here in America, our moonshine was basically made from corn, which is the abundant ingredient at the time. In Ireland, barley was the base for most of it, but like here in the U.S., when you're making illicit spirits, a lot of times you had to improvise. Here in the U.S., you do sometimes just simple sugar washes, or kind of a combination of corn and sugar, what have you. In Ireland, they would use potatoes were an obvious choice. Sometimes they would use oats, even sugar beets, sugar, molasses, kind of whatever they had to use to make whatever illicit spirits. They would a lot of times do it in remote locations, just like the moonshiners here in the U.S. One of the tricks they used was they would make their poutine on the boundaries of property, so there's kind of a justifiable deniability. Hey, it was on that property, not my property, this, that, and the other. And a lot of similar stories to the great bootleggers here in the U.S. on how they kind of got around the cops or evaded detection, stuff like that. If you're a history nerd, do a little research on the poutine makers in Ireland. Great stories. Now that we've got that out of the way, let me give the quick disclaimer. Alright, this is my mandatory disclaimer whenever we talk about doing mashes or anything that then later on would get distilled. Distillation of spirits here in the U.S., even for just home consumption, is technically illegal. That being said, there's other parts of the world that does allow for home distillation. What we're doing today is the still legal part of it, where we're just doing fermentation. Here in the U.S., if you want to ferment to create alcohol, that's perfectly legal, i.e. making beer, making wine, making mead, what have you. Once you throw it in a still and distill it, that's where the illegality comes in. But what we're going to show today is just how to make the first process, the fermentation, and then if you were in a jurisdiction where it was legal, then you would go ahead and throw this into the still and make your poutine. One other addendum, if you were in a place where it is legal, poutine a lot of times was double distilled. Here in the U.S., a lot of our moonshine, i.e. corn whiskey water, was just single distilled. Didn't have time for aging, double distillation, this, that, or the other. In Ireland, there was a little more craftsmanship to their moonshine. A lot of times quality poutine was distilled twice, and it was sometimes aged in small barrels, where here in the U.S. moonshine really did not see any wood aging. So with the disclaimer out of the way, let's see what we need to make our poutine mash. Alrighty, so now we're going to go through our poutine mash recipe. Like I said, traditionally in Ireland, they would use barley. What a guy would or what a poutine maker would do is take a grain or a bag full of barley grain, maybe throw it in the local river for a day or so, let it soak, and then let it germinate. Kind of like what we did with corn in our corn mash series. I showed you how to start the germination process, then end it, and that created something that we could then mash in. And that's what they did with barley there. Also, you could have done something similar with oats, what have you. Like I said, though, there was a lot of improvisation there. We're going to do something a little simpler. For one thing, instead of needing actual real barley, I went to my local brew shop and found barley malt already, dried barley malt, so we don't have to go through the process of malting, germination, all that stuff. So I got 1 pound of light barley malt. Like I said, the poitin makers or the Irish Moonshine makers would improvise and use other things. One of the things they would use is sugar and molasses, and that's what we're going to do just because it's easier and quicker. I've got a couple of pounds of dark brown sugar, and then I've got 16 ounces of blackstrap molasses. Molasses today is not as popular as it used to be, but hundreds of years ago, molasses was huge. It was a major international trade. It was huge in international trade, what have you, and used in cooking all the time. So people would have molasses with them all the time. And then again, through either sugar beets or imported sugar, people had sugar. So this is something the Irish would have had back a couple hundred years ago when they were making the first poitin recipes. So we've got, remember, one more time, 1 pound of dried barley malt, 2 pounds of dark brown sugar, and then 16 ounces of blackstrap molasses. I've got a couple of gallons of water here. We're going to make a 5-gallon batch. So let me get the water, bring this water up to the boil, and then we're going to add this stuff and continue on the process. Okay, so I got my 2 gallons of water almost up to a boil, and we're ready to add our ingredients. Now, the reason I'm bringing it to a boil is for sanitation purposes. Did the old Irish moonshiners do that 200 years ago? Probably not. But because we kind of know a little bit more about sanitation, and you want to do this in as sanitary of environment as possible, we brought this up to a boil. The first thing I'm going to add is our dried malt extract. If you've done any home brewing, you know when you add that dry malt extract, it kind of bubbles up, or you can almost get a boil over. And I want to get that done first. I've left plenty of headspace in my pot. That's something else if you're when you're doing whatever mash or boil, homebrew, or whatever, you want to make sure you've got a kettle big enough and leave plenty of space so when you add ingredients like dried malt extract, you're not going to get a boil over. So let me kill the flame here, and I'm going to move this over and add my extract. I've kept my molasses near the flame. You want to either throw in some hot water or get it warm to make it easier to pour in. Alright, here, get her cut open. Now, if you go to your home brew shop, there's really no special malt, dried malt extract. You can use lighter, darker, amber color, what have you. This is not like brewing a beer where, you know, color is part of the process, or, you know, we're worried about the color of the finishing product. Reality is, again, if we were making true poitin, this would go through a still. We're not worried about color then. So we'll get all this stirred in. You want to make sure there's no lumps or clumps. Move that back over. I took it off the heat because, again, just like in home brewing, when you add that malt extract, it can boil over, so that's why I took it off the heat. got that in. I'm going to go ahead and add the rest of these ingredients. I think you understand about adding sugar and molasses. We're going to add the rest of the ingredients. I'm going to throw the 2 gallons into my 5-gallon fermenter. Remember, we're making a 5-gallon batch. And then I'm going to add 3 gallons of cold water. That'll bring it down to the proper fermentation temperature. When I get that done, we'll come back to wrap up and I'll talk about how long to ferment, types of yeast, what have you. Okay, so to wrap up, I've got my liquid cooled down. We added all the ingredients. We got the liquid cooled down enough that I added the yeast, and I've done a gravity reading. Quick little note or addendum to this, because I am not going to distill this, I took a couple of steps, or there's a couple of differences from what I do here and what if you're going to make true poitin, or we're going to distill whatever. First off is I just used a regular brewing yeast. I was looking around, if you've seen the videos, got a ton of brew kits, and I just used a regular Muntins active brew yeast. Now, traditional moonshiners here in the USN and Ireland back in the day would have just used bread yeast. Modern distillers now have distiller's yeast, and if you were going to create something for distillation, you would most likely use that distiller's yeast. And where it's different from like a beer or wine yeast is, the yeast main function is not taste, but just to create as much alcohol as possible. Distiller's yeast, again, depending on the liquid you're fermenting, can get into the low 20s as far as alcohol by volume, where a lot of your wine yeast are in the teens, and your beer yeast are high single digits to low double digits. So, like I said, I just used a beer yeast because I'm going to end up, what I'm planning to do is bottle this and just try, just to give it a try. I've been to enough distillers and they always talk about distiller's beer, and I thought, well, why not try this? Do a distiller's beer. So that's what I'm going to do with this. But again, if you were to distill it, you would want to get as much alcohol out of it as possible, and that's just, again, if you were an old moonshiner trying to do this for a living, it would just be a cost beneficial thing. Also, like I said, I did a gravity reading, and our gravity on this only came out a little higher than 1.04, like 1.045 probably, which means most likely after fermentation, this is going to be a little around 5%, maybe a little higher, so it'd be kind of a beer. Again, if you're wanting to make true poitin and actually distill it, you would probably want to shoot a little higher. So if you wanted to add another 16 ounces of molasses or another pound of dried malt extract, feel free to do that and bump up your starting gravity a little bit higher. I'm going to let this ferment for 7 days. Then I'm going to bottle and let the bottles condition at room temperature for about a week or so, and then I'll throw in the fridge. If you are going to distill this, if we were in a real moonshine facility, where we would let this ferment for about 7 days and then throw in the still. If you had distiller's yeast or something called turbo yeast, that the fermentation would actually wrap up between 3 and 5 days. With that being said, like I said, I'm going to bottle this, and in a later episode, I'll do a taste for you, let you know how it tastes as far as just drinking it as a fermented beverage compared to actually distilling it. Well, I hope you liked this video. If you did, please subscribe down below. Also, please like the video. It lets YouTube know we're putting out good content. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, or other ideas, or some kind of mash or you want me to try, please leave in the comments section, or you can always contact me on the Twitter page. Well, until next time, bottoms up.